All right, now we're going to look at a second pedigree problem. We've already established two steps for identifying what kind of inheritance occurs in a pedigree. The first step, recall, was to see who was affected. Is it males or females or both? The second step was to see when the affected trait occurred. Does it occur in every generation or in every other? Recall that every generation means that you're a dominant trait, whereas skipping generations means that the trait is recessive. Likewise, appearing mostly in males means that a trait is sex-linked, and you'll learn more about this in after we do sex-linked traits. Or if it occurs in both males and females, it means that the trait is an autosomal trait, meaning that it is found on one of those 22 pairs of chromosomes, not the one pair of sex chromosomes. So let's take step 1. 1, 2, 3, 4 females are affected in this case, and 1, 2, 3, 4 males are affected in this case. So this clearly tells us that this is an autosomal trait because both men and women are affected, and they're also affected pretty equally, in this case exactly equal. Now we need to determine if it is a dominant or a recessive trait. Let's see when the trait occurs. It occurs here in the first generation. It occurs in individuals here in the second generation, and individuals here in the third generation. This means that this is a dominant trait. So it would be autosomal dominant is this particular type of inheritance. Now let's see if we can take this problem one step farther than it does. And let's see if we can determine what the probable genotypes are of these individuals. So for this, let's just use letter A, where capital A is my dominant trait and lowercase a is my recessive trait. Again, I'm not assigning a particular trait just because we're trying to just determine what the genotype is here. Recall that this type of inheritance is autosomal dominant. So, an affected individual, what are their potential genotypes? Remember that you're affected if you have the dominant trait. There are two ways that you can have the dominant trait. You could be homozygous for the dominant trait, or you could be heterozygous for the dominant trait, and both would show up. If you are unaffected, there's just one way, and this is to have the recessive, homozygous recessive genotype. So this pedigree could be for something like brown hair versus blonde hair, or brown eyes versus blue eyes. Let's take a look and see what we can determine. Looking at this pedigree, all of these affected individuals must have at least one copy of the dominant genotype. We don't necessarily know the second copy by just looking at that individual. So let's go through and we'll label these, just putting in the first allele. We don't know what the second allele is right now. We also know that everyone who is unaffected has to have the little a genotype. So all of these open circles, we can deduce our little a's. right? Let's go back to those second alleles now on the affected individuals. In order to figure out what the second allele is, we need to look at the children and the parents. Let's start up right here at the first generation. In generation 1, we have an affected individual and an unaffected individual. Let's look at their children. Some of their children are affected. They could not have gotten the affected allele from this parent. They clearly got it from this parent. Now, some of their children, most noticeably this daughter and this daughter, are unaffected. Where did their genes come from? Well, one of the little a's had to come from this parent. The second little a must have come from the other parent, because recall that during meiosis, the two copies of a gene segregate so that each egg or sperm has only one copy of that gene. During fertilization, one copy of the gene from the maternal side and one copy of the gene from the paternal side come back together. So this second copy and this second copy must have come from this parent here, making their genotype big A, little a. Let's try it and test it in a Punnett square just to see how it works. One parent down the side, the other parent across the top. And if I fill this out, I see that I have two possible genotypes, big A, little a, which would be affected, and little a, which would be unaffected, which is clearly what I see here in my offspring. Now, because these affected children got that affected allele from the affected mother right here, the other allele must have come from Dad. Dad only had little a to give, so each of these children must also have a little a. Now let's look at the third generation. So we've done generation 1, we've looked at generation 2, now let's look at generation 3. In generation 3, we have an affected daughter right here. That capital A must have come from this parent, the father. The other parent only has little a's to give. So this child is also heterozygous. The same is true for each of these sons. While this was more of a simple one, you can use the same technique to solve any sort of pedigree. There may be instances where you cannot determine the second allele in some pedigrees due to a lack of children or lack of information.